So Richard is being our able assistant with the roving mic over in the corner. So does anybody who'd like to be brave and be the first question for the panel? Say, when you do, say who you are, perhaps, and who your question is to, if it's someone specific.
Hi, I'm Eddie Curry from Birmingham City Council. My question's for Pip. Hi, Pip. Some fantastic data you're collecting there, Pippa, but I'm just really wondering what the next steps are and just what the real concerns are in terms of barriers to implement any changes.
Next steps for us, Eddie, multiple things really. Is a big driver for this for me has been how we continue to share. I feel really blessed to be in the position that we're in, where we have the headspace and the time, the relationships where we can work with all the people that's doing this work for us. So it's to continue to share, and for those that are interested is to continue to share what we're learning out of the back of it. The science really is really in its infancy. We're still like 12 months in relation to the data from the tiny tags, and we've had one full cycle of data from the Royal Holloway. So we need to continue to keep revisiting the data and keep asking the same questions. Ultimately, is what is that data now telling us in relation to the continuous change that we're seeing with climate. So there's those elements, and then how we share that among the scientists. We have to cross-populate that data across all of those researchers so that it is still feeding into the system of research. The other elements around next steps for us are connected to the black blobs. Is some of that is because we don't know the parentage of the stock that we've got, so we need to kind of do further research on the parentage to hope that that will give us the data that we need in relation to that plant stock. So I think ultimately it's continue to feed into the science, continue to learn, continue to explore, fail along the way. So in Garden for the Future, we've purposely planted some stuff that's on the amber list and close on the red list to just check whether it is amber or red. So to fail and to share. It is defining policy and procedure for the Trust in relation to how the Trust will manage woodland gardens going forwards, and how it approaches managing significant species and significant landscapes. So yeah, I kind of feel that we're still just at the start of what that does, but ultimately we still need to continue to experiment around the data that we're seeing and be okay and comfortable with us not knowing the answers. We're a live experiment ultimately in a grade 1 listed garden, which feels quite challenging. And we need to be comfortable with the fact that we're a live experiment in a grade 1 listed garden and that we don't know all of the answers connected to it. So, yeah, I think that's for us next steps.
Please do.
Just to take that point to a sort of wider question, Forestry Commission this week published a list of trees that they're going to be recommended, 30 trees for planting for woodlands across the country. There are now some very good lists that have been produced by Kevin at Kew and all sorts of other places that should be your starting points when you're thinking about what you want to plant in your sites, to go out and do some homework and see what the art of the possible is. But as Pippa's just said, the thing is, don't get wedded to the same plan for the next 20 years. Review it on a regular basis. Check what the data's showing you. Don't be afraid to fail. And if it fails when you're tree planting something, then learn from that and don't do it again. And find the next thing, unless there was a reason that you'd planted bad stock or something. You know, it was mechanical. But the lists that start coming out are really useful sort of recipe cards for success. But they are like sort of Christmas present lists. When somebody does a Christmas present list, that Christmas present list is for them. It's very bespoke. and you need to think about the bespoke list for your site, the Christmas present list for your site, and that means you've got to look at all the other bits of data out there, try it, not worry about failure. If it fails, learn from it and refine as you go over the next few years, because the next decade is going to be really interesting in terms of choices. And we really need to learn as we go, just as Pippa's doing, because that's the critical part of the future.
Anybody else? The front.
Hi, Jackie Brunton Douglas from Walsall Council. I think this one's for Ian. I think. It might be for
I'll
more.
pass it on in a second.
Yeah. One thing I took from what you've said, and I've got a big bee in my bonnet about this, is that people in this country, from a nature perspective, because we are so nature depleted and because we've been boiling our frog, we don't know what good looks like. And I think we've all got a major job to show people what good looks like for nature. And it kind of comes to Tom as well. I've planted nearly all the plants you've listed there. It made me smile because I've put them in my garden because I know they're easy to manage and maintain. And I know maintenance is our issue as well, as we'll all sat around this table. But are they the right plants for our environment, for our nature going forward? And should we be planting our nature in our streets? It's kind of all linked, but it's about, we don't know what good looks like. We're so used to seeing the Lake District within a few millimetres of its life because of sheep, thinking that that's nature, and not realising there's no eagles, there's no birds, there's no anything really apart from sheep, let's be honest. So, yeah, over to you.
I think the two parts to that, which is sort of a common theme, are the wildlife and the people in this, in that we're constantly grappling with what's the right solution in terms of, if there were no people involved, what would you do that's best for nature? But then you can't do that in isolation without considering the people aspect. Either the amount of time it's going to take to deal with the complaints, or the fact that people are going to go against what you've done, and maybe you've planted a new hedge and they're going to walk through it because that's the way they always walked, or the countless other reasons that people make things complicated. But ultimately, if we're going to support nature's recovery, we need people to be on our side, and the nature disconnect is a major barrier to that. I think it starts for us in communication. Often when we reflect on what has gone wrong in how the Wildlife Trust has operated, it's because we've missed a step in recognising we need to help people understand why. And so explaining why you're doing stuff, why something has failed, why you're going to try something else, why you're not quite sure what the solution is going to be, but we're going to have a go, why we're working in partnership, is really critical. And we are trying as an organisation to move to more nature-led decision making, trying to work with nature. So we're creating ponds where ghost ponds are, where ponds are shown on a historical map. We're planting woodlands where woodland connectivity is logical because that's where historical woodland was present. And we're trying to work with habitats and with natural processes to help nature restore itself. The challenge you have that is that fundamentally on our island, the natural processes don't quite work. So we've got an example in Coventry where we work with Coventry City Council and we have moved the course of a river. And essentially humans put the river in the wrong place 150 years ago to power industry, and we've allowed the river to flow back where it should naturally go. But it's still not performing as a natural river should function because there are other variables that are influencing it. And so we're now grappling with we let the nature do what it wanted to do, but it's not quite doing what we're expecting. Should we go and intervene? And that's like, well, if you're letting nature lead, you should probably leave it alone. But it's a real dilemma. I'm going to give you a politician's answer and say there isn't. It's not black and white, and it's really difficult. I think what we're trying to do as much as possible is to listen to people and then to explain why, and ultimately be ready to fail as well, because this is complicated, and anybody that knows or says they know what's going to happen, I think is perhaps a bit unsighted, really, because there are so many variables in the way that climate and humans are going to adapt over the next few years. It's very difficult to know.
Anybody else want to pick up on that point? Tom, perhaps on a related note, I was going to ask about something in the art of the possible, and when you're taking that scheme from complete grey and black to green, was it very difficult to get people on board with what's really possible?
I don't think it was difficult to get people on board. I thought the last question was a really interesting question because it's something I've been sort of thinking about for a long time, and particularly since sort of COVID, when we realised how important natural spaces were for people in towns and cities, and particularly where people don't necessarily have the same access to to natural spaces. And I work in Manchester City Centre, and Manchester City Centre does have some public spaces in the city, but they're quite often very hard spaces, and the planting is very cosmetic, and that's something that I'm conscious about, that we should be trying to introduce less managed sort of spaces, green spaces, so that people do have that meaningful contact with nature. I think that is really important. I think in terms of the Middle Lane scheme was slightly different because it was very much focused on rain garden type planting and trying to choose species which would tolerate those conditions of drought and then very damp conditions, and also being aware that the university had their own agenda on how they ultimately wanted it to look. I'm currently working on a park in Galway city centre at the moment, which is just south of Galway city centre. And one of the things I was starting to look at locally native sort of species, and whether you could achieve the same aesthetic really, but with native sort of species. But it does require an awful lot of research. But the park is adjacent to the coast. It overlooks Galway Bay, so it's a fantastic location, and it's adjacent to an SAC, a special area of conservation. So looking at those sort of like local coastal sort of species and bringing those into the park and really trying to do something very sort of different, if you like. So it's certainly something I'm very conscious of, and I do get a bit sick and tired of seeing those very cosmetic sort of spaces in towns and cities where you see 2 or 3 types of species that are used, and they're very sort of manicured and clipped and cosmetic, and I just think we can do a little bit more as designers and landscape architects.
The interesting questions that lies at the heart of that is there's a perceptional thing that we have to get over. I live in a 25-year-old new build that was built on an old sort of field where I live in Porchester, and it was built in a cloverleaf, so we got houses around the central green, and the central green was a bit bare. So 20 years ago when I moved in, I planted some trees and they look very nice, and all that sort of jazz. And then I decided, and all the neighbours were very happy with that, and then I decided to just get the local authority not to cut the grass. And the grass is an old turf because it's an old meadow and it's full of yarrow and yellow rattle, and over 100 bee orchids have come up and pyramid orchids have come up, and so on and so forth. And from a natural historian's perspective, from a nature perspective, it's paradise. But every one of my neighbours hates the bloody thing because it looks messy, and you can, in all the stuff I do nationally, it's all happy, slappy, everybody's keen on this stuff. But when you get home and you just don't cut the grass, and your neighbours are giving you grief all the time because the local authority have agreed to not cut the grass, it gets a bit wearing. So one of the things that we have to do as a collective is we have to articulate why it matters, because there really is a perceptional thing that was talked about earlier by Becky. There is a perceptional thing that people are on different pages, and although if through my eyes it's literally a sort of biological nirvana in the middle of a housing estate, all everybody else sees is mess. And fortunately, because I grant aid the local authority and the tree planting is paid for by me, they're quite prepared to cut me some slack and not cut the grass. But if it was just regular Joe, then that might not have happened, and the amount of noise around would have got rid of 100 bee orchids. So what Becky was talking about earlier about engaging people and making that conversation happen, that's really, really vital to the next stage of this journey. Because if we don't do that, then frankly, we are all a bit wasting our time. Do you want to?
I think to summarise what everyone said today really is the worry of the disconnect. And, you know, the active design programme, just bringing people back in and understanding the symbiosis with nature and fitness and health and mental, physical well-being, sustainable cities, everything. You know, and we have been, political rabbit hole we won't go down, but we have been conditioned, I think, certainly over the last 30, 40 years, to see ourselves as entirely separate from and superior to nature. And now we have the temerity to complain that she's fighting back. And I find it bizarre and a uniquely human trait that we have. And that's not to say that the people in the room feel like that, because that's why you're here, right? But there's an awful lot of people out there who have been conditioned. They are not willing participants in this, but they have been conditioned to think that nature is a problem, that it needs to be managed, that something not curated is wrong, that, you know, weeds, is it the statement, weeds are just flowers growing in the wrong place? You know, why are we looking at those and not relishing them? Why are we not understanding our place in this fragile ecosystem? Why are we not preserving bees, insects, understanding that without that, the house of cards falls and we go with it? Back to that statement I made earlier about the echo chamber, we cannot assume that people are on our side. We need to help educate, and the why that you mentioned is the fundamental. We have to explain, not because people are stupid, but because society conditions them to think that shiny and human driven is brilliant and nature is in our way and something that we need to destroy for our benefit, really.
Just one final thing on that from me. The critical part of behaviour change is meeting people where they are and understanding what their level of awareness is and being able to communicate on that terms. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier in my talk around the removal of the emphasis of Latin names within the Wildlife Trust. We're not saying that it's not important to know what species are, because it is, and we're not saying that expertise is no longer valued, because it really is. But actually, we're in the danger of talking in the echo chamber to people that are already engaged and already use the parks, already love nature. They're already passionate supporters, but people who are less engaged and have become disconnected with nature need that first step on the ladder. And in order to get that first step on the ladder, we need to meet them where they are and not expect them to be ready to understand our communication message. So it's us, unfortunately, who've got to do the hard work to tailor our messaging to meet them.
And if any of yourself had to deal with my neighbours, please talk to me. Because it ain't easy sometimes.
There's a cue to care where you leave the bit in the middle to grow wild, but you cut around the edge, so it shows that it's deliberate. Yeah, but also the short.
Yeah.
So you've been there.
But in that journey, there is a mutualistic journey of if it starts to become normalised that parks have wild areas across all of you, then people will get to the point where they just, that's just normal, and that's the part we're just on the edge of,
Brilliant, thank you. So unless we have any other burning questions in the room, I'd like to draw the Q&A to a close, and if we say thank you again to all of our speakers from this morning.